In an entertainment empire where glory can be purchased with money, but presence can be stripped away by invisible mechanisms, disappearance is never simply about being absent. It is a state, a process, and sometimes it's a decision so standardized that it does not even require an announcement. Yu Menglong is not the first name to fall into this state, but the silence surrounding him carries an extraordinary weight, one large enough to make keen observers feel that this is no longer a coincidence. There has been no official announcement stating that Yu Menglong is withdrawing from the industry. There has been no confirmation of a personal crisis, nor a publicly recorded scandal to explain his prolonged absence. Instead, the name that once appeared regularly in the gears of the Chinese entertainment industry has begun to become difficult to find, difficult to mention, and gradually, difficult to exist within the familiar media space. Search results have shifted. Old posts have vanished. Links that were once clear have become blurred, as if a presence long enough to be named had never existed at all. The noteworthy aspect is not that an artist has disappeared. The entertainment industry has long been accustomed to cycles of appearance and withdrawal. What makes this story different is the way the silence has been maintained in a synchronized, persistent manner, leaving no gap for a conventional explanation. No one denies the existence of Yu Menglong, yet no one actively mentions him. There is no public mandate, yet there is a boundary that everyone seems to clearly understand. It is within this void that the public has begun to feel an unnamed instability. When a non-controversial name becomes a subject of avoidance, the natural question that arises is not what did he do, but why has mentioning him become so sensitive? And this question is not posed through loud proclamations, but through a silent comparison between what once was and what is now missing. Yu Menglong at that time had not yet become a symbol. He was merely an absent artist, mentioned in scattered conversations, cautious comments, and speculations that dared not go too far. But that very caution was the first sign that this story was not operating according to the usual logic of a fluctuating career. When so many people choose silence simultaneously, that silence begins to carry meaning. And it is precisely here that the story no longer revolves only around an individual. It opens up a larger, more uncomfortable, and more dangerous question for any system based on the control of the image. When presence can be erased without explanation, who decides the boundary between existence and disappearance? Yu Menglong, though silent, has unintentionally stood at the center of that question, like a quiet landmark signaling that there are mechanisms of power that only reveal themselves when we begin to notice gaps too perfect to be coincidental. To understand why Yu Menglong's absence could persist without an official explanation, the story must be placed within the exact context in which he existed. The Chinese entertainment industry is not merely a space for creativity and individual expression. It is an ecosystem operating through contracts, image safety indices, and rules that are not always written but are strictly followed. In this ecosystem, an artist's career depends not only on talent or a fan base, but is also tightly bound to the ability to maintain a risk-free status for the entire structure. Yu Menglong entered the industry with a relatively stable image. He did not emerge as a controversial phenomenon, nor did he build his name through statements that challenged norms. His presence for many years was steady and controlled. Projects appeared on rhythm. Public appearances created no conflict. In an environment inherently sensitive to volatility, this was the type of profile considered safe. Consequently, the first signs of his absence did not trigger an immediate reaction. A schedule was adjusted. A project was announced as delayed. An appearance was cancelled without a specific reason. Each individual detail was small enough to be interpreted as routine internal adjustments. The entertainment industry is used to rapid change, and the public is used to not always being provided with full information. However, the difference lay in how these adjustments repeated according to the same pattern. There was no announcement saying Yu Menglong was taking a break. There was no confirmation that he was shifting his career path. There was also no explanation regarding personal issues. Instead, there was a series of voids. Each individual void could be ignored, but when strung together, they formed a silhouette familiar to those who had witnessed similar cases in the past. In this environment, silence is not merely a lack of information. It is a state maintained by tacit consensus. Media platforms do not actively report. Partners do not mention his name. Former collaborators choose to avoid the subject when asked. It is not because there is a public order, but because everyone understands the limits of what should be said. Yu Menglong gradually became a subject that no one actively brought up, even though no one publicly denied his existence. This mechanism does not require powerful proclamations. It operates effectively precisely because of its ambiguity. When there is no official explanation, there is no specific object to protest. When no allegations are raised, there is nothing to rebut. Silence, in this case, is not a void, but a protective shell for the system, allowing everything to continue operating without facing uncomfortable questions. It was in this context that an individual's questioning became particularly sensitive. A high-level executive in the industry, according to accounts, was not an outsider. He understood clearly how decisions were made, the boundary between what could be discussed and what should be left alone. In an internal exchange that was supposed to be routine, where issues are presented in technical and safe language, he chose to raise a query directly related to the case of Yu Menglong. That question, as described, was not confrontational. It did not accuse anyone, nor did it speculate on motives. It merely pointed out the unusual overlap between the mentions of Yu Menglong and the immediate silent reactions following them. In a system accustomed to ignoring blurred points, the act of asking such a question was enough to be seen as crossing the line. It did not break a law, but it touched upon what many chose not to see. The system's reaction, viewed from the outside, occurred with a speed and precision hard to ignore. There was no dismissal notice. No disciplinary measures were announced. That executive simply no longer appeared in the positions that once belonged to him. Important meetings took place without his name on the list. Decision-making power was narrowed. His presence was blurred out in the same way Yu Menglong's had been. This moment marked a significant turning point in the story. It showed that the case of Yu Menglong was not just about an artist, but was a test of how the system reacts when asked for an explanation. The removal of the questioner was not intended to send a public message, but to reinforce a tacit principle. There are issues that do not need to be clarified, and those who attempt to clarify them will place themselves in a zone of risk. From that moment, the story no longer remained internal. Observers began to realize that there was a clear link between Yu Menglong's absence and the disappearance of the only person who dared to ask about him. When these two voids appeared in parallel, coincidence became unconvincing. And it was this lack of conviction that paved the way for the next phase, where the public shifted from a sense of unease to purposeful observation. The disappearance of the high-level executive did not create an immediate shockwave. The surface of the entertainment industry continued to operate as smoothly as usual. Broadcast schedules were announced on time. New promotional campaigns were not interrupted. Mainstream media gave no sign that anything unusual was occurring. But it was precisely this composure that made observers feel uneasy. For the public, especially those accustomed to following the behind-the-scenes of the entertainment world, the overlap became too obvious to ignore. Yu Menglong vanished from official channels without explanation. The only person who questioned his status also vanished in the same manner. There was no new information, yet there were too many similarities. In an environment where information is often truncated and adjusted, the gaps themselves became valuable data. The initial reactions were not collective. They appeared sporadically, in the form of small questions in comment sections, personal posts without tags, and individual exchanges between acquaintances. No one asserted what had happened. No one drew a conclusion. The questions were often posed cautiously, as if the act of asking itself required deliberation. Does anyone notice? Why is everything happening the same way? These questions were not intended to cause controversy, but merely to record a common feeling. Something does not fit. This very caution helped these reactions persist long enough to be seen by others. Because they did not take the form of an allegation, they were difficult to remove. Because they did not point toward a specific conclusion, they did not create a clear target for rebuttal. The public, in this way, began to build a shared observational space, where each person contributed only a small fragment of memory. When official platforms provided no explanation, a segment of the audience began to reconstruct the timeline themselves. Old interviews of Yu Menglong were rediscovered. Partnership announcements that once existed and then vanished were archived. Timelines related to the high-level executive were placed side by side. No single piece of evidence was enough to confirm anything, but when placed together, they formed a pattern familiar to those who had witnessed similar cases in the past. At this stage, the public reaction was more observational than confrontational. There was no sharp polarization. One group believed this was merely coincidental, or the result of internal adjustments that outsiders did not need to know. Another group believed the consistency of the silent reactions was too clear to be dismissed. The important thing was that both viewpoints coexisted, and this coexistence prevented the story from being framed within a single conclusion. A notable shift occurred when the acts of silence began to carry specific consequences. Certain projects indirectly related to Yu Menglong were delayed without a public reason. Some brands adjusted their communication content to avoid mentioning elements that could trigger associations. These changes were not large enough to become news, but they were numerous enough to create a sense that the entire system was self-adjusting in the same direction. From here, public behavior began to change. Not through words, but through choices. Some audience members actively avoided consuming products related to entities perceived to be benefiting from the silence. There was no official list, no public call for a boycott. There were only individual decisions, repeated, based on the same memory being shared tacitly. Each individual decision was insignificant, but collectively they began to create signals that the system could not entirely ignore. Crucially, this reaction spread beyond its initial scope. When domestic information was restricted, external communities began to translate what remained. Analytical articles appeared on international platforms, not mentioning Yu Menglong directly, but clearly alluding to the pattern taking place. The more it was suppressed in one place, the further the story echoed elsewhere. The domestic silence, therefore, was no longer sufficient to control how the story was understood abroad. During this phase, Yu Menglong gradually shifted positions in the public perception. He was no longer just an absent artist. He became a reference point. Every time a new project was delayed without explanation, people remembered his case. Every time another name abruptly disappeared from the media, the memory of Yu Menglong was invoked, even without mentioning his name. His presence shifted from the physical to the symbolic. This transformation made it difficult for the system. There was no climax to extinguish. There was no leader to negotiate with. There were no demands to meet. Instead, there was a state of prolonged observation, where every action of the system was remembered and compared with the past. In that context, every decision of silence was no longer viewed as neutral, but became a new signal for the public to interpret. This was the moment when the decentralized boycott truly took shape. It did not explode, it accumulated. It did not rely on immediate emotion, but on long-term memory. The public no longer asked, what happened to Yu Menglong? But began to ask, why are stories like this always handled the same way? And that question, once asked enough times, began to transcend the scope of an individual and touch upon how the entire system operates. The darkest phase of the story did not come from an explosive event, but from its prolongation. There was no communique. no denial. No explanation was provided even as the abnormal signs moved beyond the realm of personal speculation. Yu Menglong remained absent. The high-level executive still had not returned. And the system, instead of responding, chose to keep moving as if nothing needed to be clarified. This prolongation shifted the nature of the crisis. If in the early stage the question revolved around what had happened, by now the focus had shifted to why there was no answer. Each day that passed without a response no longer helped to calm public opinion. On the contrary, it accumulated more doubt. In an environment where every message is meticulously calculated, prolonged silence became the clearest message of all. Consequences began to appear in elusive ways. It was not a sudden collapse, but small yet continuous adjustments. A brand that had previously collaborated closely adjusted its communication strategy. A project considered safe was unexpectedly postponed for further review. Certain international partners chose to keep their distance, not through a statement, but by simply not continuing. No one said these decisions were directly related to Yu Menglong, yet no one denied that the general context had shifted. For the system, this was the most awkward time. Responding directly would mean admitting that something needed to be explained. Continuing the silence meant accepting that every subsequent action would be placed under the lens of collective memory. There was no longer a truly safe choice. Familiar reflexes that were once effective in the past now carried risk. Yu Menglong, throughout this entire period, still did not appear to tell his own story. He provided no explanation, nor did he rebut the spreading speculations. But that very absence highlighted his new role in the public consciousness. He was no longer seen as an individual needing protection or attack. He became a landmark. A name that, whenever the system chose silence, people would unconsciously compare it against. This transformation marked the climax of the story. The public no longer needed new information to maintain their interest. They already had a pattern to reference. Every time a similar situation appeared, even if it involved a different character, the first reflex was no longer to wait for an explanation, but to remember how the story was handled. Yu Menglong, in that way, became a benchmark for every silent crisis thereafter. Notably, this reaction did not lead to chaos. There was no new loud wave of boycott. No collective demands were issued. Instead, there was a state of prolonged vigilance. The public observed more closely. Consumption decisions became more cautious. Support was no longer taken for granted, it became something to be considered. It was this silent change that forced the system to adjust. At the internal level, according to accounts, the way discussions were held also began to change. The question was no longer whether a response was needed, but how this silence would be remembered. This was an important shift. It showed that control over the narrative was no longer entirely in the hands of spokespeople, but had shifted to how the public preserved and interpreted memory. Yu Menglong was not exonerated, nor was there any official evidence provided to conclude what had happened. But that was no longer the focus. In an environment where the truth is often delayed, the lack of a conclusion does not mean the story ends. On the contrary, it makes the story persist longer, in the form of a lesson that is unwritten but always present. By this point, it can be said that the decentralized boycott had completed its role. Not by toppling an individual or forcing an organization to publicly admit a mistake, but by changing behavior. The system did not become ideally transparent, but it became more cautious. And that caution did not stem from legal or media pressure, but from the fear of being remembered. Yu Menglong, in that way, departed from the story as a specific human being to exist as a concept. A reminder that silence is not always invisible, and that there are names that, even if they no longer appear, continue to influence how decisions are made. When a system must change because of memory, it is a sign that power has begun to shift, however slowly. There is no clear moment of conclusion for this story. no press conference closed the doubts. No official document confirmed what had happened to Yu Menglong. Time continued to flow, new projects appeared, and other faces stepped into the spotlight. On the surface, the entertainment industry seemed to have returned to its familiar rhythm. But beneath that flow, something had changed irreversibly. Yu Menglong did not return to reclaim his position. The high-level executive did not appear to tell the story from the inside. Their absence was not compensated for by any explanation. Yet, that very absence became the answer that the public remembered. Not an answer for right or wrong, but for another, more important question. When a system chooses silence in the face of repeated doubts, what will the public do with its attention? The answer, as seen, did not come from an explosive outburst of rage or direct confrontations. It came from a quiet adjustment in the way memory and choices were made. The public did not need to shout to create pressure. They only needed not to forget. Once collective memory was formed, every subsequent decision of silence was placed into a broader context, where it was no longer viewed as neutral but as a signal to be decoded. At this very point, Yu Menglong was no longer an absent artist. He had become an invisible measure of conscience and justice in the social memory. Each time another name abruptly vanished, each time a question was left hanging, the memory of him was invoked without the need to mention his name. The truth, in this case, does not exist in the form of a published report, but in the form of a remembered pattern. The greatest lesson from this story does not lie in the fate of an individual, but in the silent shift in the relationship between the public and power. Gone are the days when silence was seen as a safe choice to wait for attention to subside. After Yu Menglong, silence has become a type of data, evidence of an inconsistency that collective memory does not easily overlook. The system may not change immediately, but they have begun to fear the power of being remembered. Yu Menglong, at this conclusion, no longer exists as a story needing to be solved, but as a long-lasting reminder that there are stories which, even without an official communique, possess enough power to shape how we perceive the world. And that power, no matter how strong, cannot completely control how the public preserves its memories. The question for the future remains open. When the darkness of silence repeats, will it continue to be a solid wall, or will it collapse before a public that has learned to observe through behavior rather than noise? The answer, perhaps, does not lie in upcoming proclamations, but in the very quiet yet indelible presence of a memory that has been retained.